Welcome back. This is video number 2 of Masterclass, Why Your Tracks Don't Sound Like the Pros. If you haven't yet, just check out video number 1. You can find the full playlist in the description of this video and start with that. It's important there's some foundation and concepts that I want to be aware of before moving along. So this video, we're going to be covering 3 major concepts. Composition, we're talking about arrangements, and instrumentations. These are critical for a good music production, even before getting any farther. So let's dive in and hope you enjoy it. The composition step is one of the most disregarded aspects of a great music production process. What we're going through and the next steps that will follow, which has to do with the type of arrangement and instrumentation, this is going to have probably a problematic effect on the continuation without having a solid composition. So that's why in my process and also my recommendation to you is to focus on composition, and I will provide you with some guidelines about what should be looking at when we are looking at songwriting. There's a huge amount of information on the internet with a lot of technical details about composition techniques and so forth. I don't believe this is something that we need to cover in this masterclass, but I can provide you basically the tips of where you should be focusing on, you as a musician, just to be successful and continue along with the music production process based on this. So what we're going to be focusing on composition. What's important in the composition stage? There are 3 aspects that have to do with the shape of a composition, a figure, I will call it. It's the melodic lines, basically the voice leading principle, and the range and within the instrument tessitura. Basically, the melodic lines, probably the melody, is one of the aspects of the music which is, I would say, the most important one, reaching out to the listener very strongly. And we need to make sure that we build good melodic lines. There are people that are amazing melodists, and this is a good thing to be focusing on. Even everyone as a musician, start putting more attention about how we build our melodies. Sometimes we have a tendency to write melodies based on a certain chord progression, which is fine. And sometimes, because we are kind of restrained about the melodic lines being adapted to the chord progression, we disregard the fitness of a melodic line. The first thing I want to talk about melodic line is to be cohesive. What does it mean to be cohesive? Means that when we are listening to a melody, the melody is a phrase, as a sentence, and we need to make sure that it has a start, there's a continuation that makes sense, and it's logical, and it has an end. Long melodic lines are very problematic, as the same way as we are talking and having very long sentence that nobody actually can hear anymore, can listen to or pay attention to it anymore. So cohesive also means from the aspect of the geometry of the melody line, meaning how we actually are putting our notes, in which frame we're putting our notes together that makes sense. A lot of jumping around. There's a lot of information about how we are going to be putting some intervals in between the notes and so forth. But a common sense means that the cohesive melodic lines is something that once you have completed that and you're away from your DAW, if you're able to sing that melody line, and this is typically what I do in my work, it doesn't really matter whether it is a song or is a instrumental. If you are able to sing it and you enjoy the singing of that particular melody, that means that from your perspective it's a good cohesive line. And you can actually massage that later when you're actually applying some other arrangements, but that's the baseline. Also, the melodic line needs to bring emotion. Make sure that, and you will feel that whenever you combine that with the chord progression, there are melodic lines that adapt so well to the chord progression that bring a lot of emotion into that. So keep that in mind and put a lot of focus on that. The other aspect of that is if we are doing melodic lines applied to vocal arrangements or any type of instrument running parallel lining in polyphonic type of arrangement, it's a good practice to look at the aspect of the voice leading principles. Whoever is not familiar with the voice leading means that applying a set of parallel melodies around the chord progression, we need to make sure that we are looking into minimizing the jumps in between the notes from chord to chord. This is very important because the listen attached to that, and there's some sort of a harmony aspect of that that makes the everything that has to do with the melodic lines to be cohesive. So voice leading principle is something very good to take into account. And also when we're looking at instruments, if you're going to be playing an instrument, and even if we're talking about the vocal melody, make sure that we are running the range of the melody that is within the instrument tessitura. Whoever is not familiar with the tessitura is basically a range of notes that is typically within the overall range of the instrument of a vocal for which that particular instrument or vocal sounds the best, with the highest power, and can transmit and feel the instruments in a way that it is in the best possible tonality. Just as an example, I could potentially run or write a line on for example, of a flute, playing like I would say a C4. The flute can obviously can play that. The problem is that in the context of the music, doesn't translate well that particular tone in the flute. We are expecting the flute to be in a higher position, even though that the range of the instrument it's capable of dealing with that. It has to do to, when we're talking about tessitura, we're talking about best practices. If you're looking for a specific effect by using, the same example of a flute of a lower register, when there is no conflict or clashes with other instruments, this is a good practice. You can actually work on those ranges, even not optimal for that instrument, because it will provide some sort of intimacy or some sort of effect that we want to have. But in general terms, make sure you understand the tessitura even for the vocal arrangement as well. Guideline number 2, whoever is not familiar with popular chord progressions for pop music or even for classical music, make sure you're familiar with that. It doesn't really mean that we are going to be copying chord progressions from other things, but we do not have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, we need to make sure that at least we understand the familiar chord progressions, such as the 2-5-1s, the 1-6-2-5, etc. All those that are being used in pop music, in jazz, in classical music, and so forth, because it gives us some sort of a context, or we can use that in our or purpose of the music. You can modify it, and you can basically make your own chord progressions based on that. But knowing those familiar chord progressions, it will get you in a spot where you're going to be able to make decisions much faster and understand the baseline. So, as I said before, start with that. Explore the different chord progressions for the genre of music that you're typically are composing for, and then go into, say, this is something on my own that cannot develop variations into that. It's very good, but start with the familiar ones. Guideline number 3, my recommendation, this is what I've been using for 2 decades already. Sketch out your compositions and draft ideas with MIDI. I mean, today's composition, MIDI is a great tool because it's very flexible. You don't have to actually record acoustic instrument to do a lot of sketching. You have some ideas, you have some chord progressions, you have some melodies that you can basically edit and at the note level without having any impact on everything, and you can improving whatever your idea was at the beginning. So it provides you with the maximum flexibility. I understand that most of the musicians are familiar with MIDI. Those who are not, please explore that, because MIDI, even if it's not your main instrument type of composition method, it will provide you some sort of a great sketching element for you to start. Even if you're a guitarist and you are composing music for guitar, it's a good idea that you figuring out beyond the guitar what the possibilities are by using MIDI. And then you can either apply your guitar knowledge to do that, or essentially transform that in whatever you believe the guitar, in this case, could do for you. But it's a good starting point, and I strongly recommend that you have some sort of a MIDI controller on board and have it ready when you have some sort of an idea. Just grab a piano or something with your DAW and start sketching out the things. It will give you a lot of great ideas to work from. Guideline number 4 is related to write your compositions with timbres and textures in mind. I think that we already covered some of the aspects that have to do with the melody lines, but right now I'm talking about timbres and textures in mind. We're talking about timbres, we're talking about specific instruments. In any case, timbres of instrument vary. That depends of the harmonics of that instrument emits on top of the fundamentals of the sound. And we can play with those, and when we are composing music, we can use that in our advantage and use different timbres or different instruments for different portions or sections of the compositions, such as first using some sort of, let's say, going back to the same exercise of the flute, I can use the timbre of the flute and then combine that into a timbre of an English horn, for example, doing a continuation of the melodic line. The way that we perceive music is not just by the notes, but it's actually the combination of the harmonics of the instrument itself. If you're talking about textures, texture is basically the combination of the different instruments, how they basically sound together. So even if you're working on composition of modern music or digital music, make sure you play around with the texture. Say you can combine different instruments, such as a piano and a guitar, in a different register, and look at the effect of that. And you will be surprised when you are doing this composition how you can put richer compositions by playing around with the textures and the different combination of instruments. Guideline number 5, experiment with harmonies and different chord progressions over a given melody can get you to a new level. This is something that I use a lot in my compositions, and I've already seen in some other great composers do that. It works like this. Essentially, you develop a melody, and in one passage of your composition, you play the melody with a certain progression of chord progression, and then when you have to repeat that passage, you change the harmony or you change the chord progression. It takes the song to a whole new different world, okay, even though that the melody is exactly the same. In order to demonstrate that, I would like to hear a melody line just I put together for this exercise. The first melody line is based on a very, I would say, slow pace chord progression, with, I would say, a very key-centered chord progression. And the second one that we're going to see is a completely new story. It's a very dense chord progression, and we are adding more chords using exactly the same melody with a lot of chromatic harmony, and you will see the impact of that melody. You will recognize it, but in the context of the music, you can see how everything changes only by changing the chord progression. Let's start hearing, first of all, the chords arrangement number 1, which is the standard diatonic chord progression, low density. You probably heard very typical, very, I would say, diatonic around the kind of the C major key center. And the layout of the chords is we are using 1 chord per bar, okay? But everything you can see here, we have chord progressions such as the 2-5-6 and so forth, very known. So what would happen to this melody if I would change the harmony? And the harmony could be anything. Okay, I can actually go into chromatic type of harmony and modulating to a different key or so forth. So the second one is a demonstration how the same melody could be changed by using a more dense chord progression and using chromatic harmony. Let's hear that. So you can hear that the only thing in common from these two different arrangements is the final G7 sus. The rest is basically changing around. You can see the chromatic harmony going from a D minor 7 to a E flat major 7 and then A flat 7 and so forth. But you can perceive, and this is basically my point, is try to explore with when you're using different passages of the same melody, not just use a different arrangement on instrumentation, but try to change the overall chord progression. And we can actually work on some other type of repetition type of things. We're going to see it in the next arrangement cycle, that you can actually transpose that using exactly the same chord progression transpose. But the point here was to make sure that you explore that because it provides, it's kind of another color in your painting, and you can take that to your advantage. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this is something that there's a lot of material available and so forth, but I want to make concise illustrations of what you should be looking at for composition principles. What are the topics that I believe that are important for you to take into account when you're composing music? Let's talk about the first one. One principle, it's called the repetition, and we talked about that earlier in the context of using different harmony. We start responding to something positively after hearing it a certain number of times. This is human nature, and you probably have experienced that yourself. You've been hearing something and you start actually enjoying or responding or connecting to that particular material once the repetition comes. It's because when it is familiar, it becomes something that we can connect better. It's part of the human nature and psychology that we would like to have something that we feel is familiar. So the repetition principle is something that is being used across the board. It doesn't really matter what type of music or genre we're using. The repetition is something that it's needed. Just in the context of the opposite, there are some what I call different type of composition, which is called one through or flow through, which is a series of elements transitioning to each other when there's no repetition at all. And this is something that can be done over some sort of an effect. If we intend to do that in film music or some other type of application, we can do that. But if you're talking about traditional type of composition, either classic or modern music, repetition is something that you need to incorporate into your own writing. The second principle is what I call the contrast. The contrast is actually the opposite of repetition, and again is also part of the human nature to connect to that. And you probably have experienced that yourself when you hear something all of the same all the time, and then what it actually wakes you up is something that is basically alert you with we have sudden changes. In the music's standpoint, those changes could be anything. Could be a tempo change, could be a key change, could be an intensity, could be a chord progression or a texture where I'm using a different instrumentation. Anything could be a change that is different from what I just passed. So as we are kind of putting up together a dish in the cooking recipe, along with the repetition, we also need the contrast. Make sure that you incorporate that. A typical or practical example of music is when we are writing a chorus passing over after the certain verse number 1, verse number 2, then we have the chorus. The chorus is a variation or some sort of a changes in the steady situation that we can consider being the verse. And then we have the bridge, which could be something different, and so forth. That will lead us to something we're going to talk about later on, which is the musical forms. But for now, make sure that repetition and contrast is something that you should be using, alternating in between them to maintain some sort of interest in the listener. Okay, the two should be able to coexist in the same piece. Guideline number 3 is crucial. It's called arc. The arc is we need to create an emotional arc. You have heard anything from modern music to classical music. We are actually building something up. We get into a climax of the piece, and then we not just create that climax. We need to be able to know where that climax should be and how to stress it. It's not just enough to say, oh, I have a climax here. People need to be able to recognize and realize that there's a climax, because this is what is the music all about. So emotional arc means that we cannot go steady on creating emotions exactly in the same way along the whole composition. We need to create those little pieces when we say, great, okay, we cannot go at the beginning because we're going to be burning up, the great things that we could potentially offer in that composition. So make sure that you're looking into that and say, oh, this is the right time, and the climax will be in this spot over here. There could be a chorus or could be anything, a solo of an instrument or so forth, and make sure you can stress it as much as you can, because people react to that very much. Guideline number 4, any type of music must have a message or a meaning. Okay, it doesn't really matter if you're talking about a song which has lyric or anything that is instrumental music. We need to be able to have to transmit meaning to the composition. So if you're looking at lyrics, make sure that the lyrics have an emotional impact, and that must be attached to the music that the lyrics is on top of. Meaning that if you're having something that lyrics stress out something very emotional, obviously make sure that the musical meaning of that for that particular lyrics has exactly the same situation, emotional impact. So make sure that when you're combining lyrics with music or solo in the instrumental, make sure that you have that in mind. Message and meaning in music is probably king. is, I would say, is king, and is probably one of the most important things that you can actually take into consideration in composition. It's a good starting point for me to provide you with some tips about what do's and what not to do when we are dealing with composition. And this is something that I've been learning throughout the years, and I want to pass it on to you because I think you will have a good advantage, take good advantage of that. So the first one is there are people that are very concerned about dissonances in music, and with the same token as we talked about having this type of steady state and contrast in the music, dissonance is part of the music as well. Why is part of the music? Because we need to create a balance between the both so we can create the balance of tension and release. Everything is actually without tension, we get bored. Everything is tension, and with dissonance, we actually get ourselves a little bit nervous about. So I think that one of the key aspects of a good composition is how you manage these two elements of that to make sure that you are creating, with the tension, you're creating a release. It's a great moment during the song or the compositional theme. So keep that in mind. The other aspect is try to avoid voices arrangement which involves parallel fifths or parallel octaves. This is probably more in the field of instrumental or orchestral music, but it can also be applied to in some sort of for vocal arrangements and multiple or polyphonic arrangements. When we are having in the vertical sense, right, we are having some sort of arrangement which includes fifth or parallel, which means one note is a fifth over, is moving a fifth or a parallel octave down or up. That actually tells us nothing about the harmony, and it creates some sort of a void in the overall harmony. So parallel fifth means that two adjacent voices are actually parallel running in fifth or parallel octaves. I'm not saying that you should not be doing that, never. But this is something that is best practice not to do that, specifically on this type of voice arrangements. Item number 3, or do and don'ts number 3. Try not to invent the wheel. And let me tell you that there is not absolute originality in anything. The originality is some sort of a concept that it's applied to each individual based on their background, on what they've heard on music all the time. And the originality is based on the fact of using those elements and taking them to a next level or to a different level. It's not saying I want to do something original, because at this point of time, you're probably understand that there is something that is not truly original. But the message here is, when you're looking into original thing, make sure that you understand that it's okay to look at frameworks or something that unconsciously you're actually applying to your music and taking that into another type of music which makes it your own. That's the message here, and this is very important. Item number 4 is there's a lot of people, and it happened to me in the past, I didn't get to the piano or my instrument until I feel inspired, I'm going to start writing music. Typically, and what happens to me is I can go into my instrument and start, practicing things and doing things, and I discover a lot of things at the instrument itself. So give yourself time in creating that based on whenever we want. Sit on your instrument, sit at your preferred instrument, play around with that. I can provide you with, some example of myself. I I just restringed my acoustic guitar, and I was so amazed about the new quality of the sound after the new strings. When I played it, is, that was for me enough, was to just to compose a new piece of music. So you don't have to be inspired. Just write music on a regular basis, and whenever you have the time, it's amazing the type of things that you can do, even without not planning for them, or not even if you're not feeling inspired at the moment. The other aspect I want to, it looks trivial, but the title of your work is important. Okay, make sure that you're connected to the music also on your title. Some people, they put a title that the same as the titles on YouTube videos. Sometimes they don't fit, and we don't get a lot of visibility, or actually it doesn't present the good idea of what the piece of music is about. So you're done, or at the beginning, look at your title and try to put some thoughts about it, because it will also help you, if you haven't composed it yet, to guide you through the process itself of composition. Guideline number 6, don't use the learned techniques against you. There's a lot of people that, very talented musicians, instrumentalists, that they are so aware of their techniques that they've learned throughout the years, that at some point of time, they actually get blind on the sense of looking at the technique themselves as part of the composition, as opposed to composing with emotions and from the heart itself. So my advice to you is, use your technique in order to enhance and take advantage of what you've learned throughout the years to make your composition richer and better. But do not use that as a barrier or kind of a stop sign for you to compose music. And guideline number 7, people are afraid of being a little bit depressed, or being uneasy about what other people think about our music. But from my personal experience, I learned a lot from people that are not even musicians. They don't know anything about music, but they can tell you sincerely what they think about the composition. This is what we call the honest, objective advice. And if you're looking at a person that is a musician as well, it's good. Maybe he can provide some tips about some musical aspect of that. But I've learned most of the time from people that were not actually musicians. They were just listeners, and it helped me a lot to weave around what my compositions sound like that. So use that as well. This is a tool that you will benefit from. Now we're going to talk about the arrangement following the composition. The same as composition, the arrangement is something that everyone does, but doesn't really understand the powerful effect that it has in the music, not just in the music, but also in the audio processing. Arrangement means that you will have a good arrangement, will have a good mix, or a potential for a good mix or a better mix, that if we have an arrangement that has some issues with. Okay, and we're going to talk about clashing effects. We're picking out the wrong choices on the instrumentation and so forth. So just to define what an arrangement is in the overall context, the arrangement is basically adapting a composition for a specific instrumentation, but this is the key, while retaining the original essence, which means that we have a set of instrumentation and a set of musical elements that we will combine, and we will be able to transmit the essence of the original composition, which would be the 3 elements: the rhythm, the melody, and the chord progression or the harmony. into a full set of instruments. Now, how we choose the instruments is key for the next steps, and this is what I've learned throughout the years. A bad arrangement will not reach that far, and you're probably going to have issues recording it, and also by when you mix it, and obviously when you try to master that. So once you have a smart composition, make sure that you rethink anything that has to do with arrangement. What is the optimal way of thinking of the combination of the different instruments in order to make it work in the best possible way? So there are three aspects that I want to take into account when we're talking about arrangement. The first one is the emotional impact. The emotional impact means that we should be able to arrange the instrumentation in the piece of music to create that emotional impact. So, for example, if I have a symphony or some sort of a classical type of music, and I can create a huge emotional impact by combining, for example, a passage where I have the full strings arranged to play a melody, for example, and then the accompaniment could be probably the brass and the woodwinds. And that will create emotional impact because the strings have been chosen as the element in the arrangement to push forward with the melody. And we know we need to understand exactly how those instruments work together, but basically understand each one of the instruments or the set of instruments we're talking about. So when you're looking at the arrangement, make sure that you're optimizing the combination of instruments so you create the emotional impact. Which one of the instruments is the one that should be playing the melody? Which one should be the one playing the secondary melody, if there is one? And what should be the one doing the accompaniment or the harmonic progression on top of that? And how we are going to lay out, for example, the percussion. Okay, who's going to be doing what in the percussion to create the balance in between the different percussion elements. So the other aspect of the arrangement is to keep listener engaged. What does it means that what we're trying to do is if we were to do exactly the same arrangement along the whole composition, we probably listener will get bored. Okay, sometimes I'm going to swap the melody being played by a different section, a different set of instruments, and I'm going to be swapping the different functions of the instrument or using a different percussion combination to do that. So the arrangement is not only just to make sure that we have all the instruments involved, but it's a smart way to keep the listener engaged. What can I do with the instruments now that I'm going from passage 1 to passage 2? How are we going to get them engaged? Think about that because it's crucial for you to succeed when you are arranging music. It's not just, I need to play the passage, we have this chord progression and this melody. You need to think outside the box and trying to understand how can I do better in terms of engaging the listener with something else and be creative with the arrangement. And this, of course, is going to have to do with your experience when you arrange music. It doesn't really matter if there's modern music or classical music. In time, you're going to be able to identify clearly what are the best arrangements going to work for the music you composed. And the third item, which is critical, and this is where 90% of people will fail with the arrangement, and they're going to figure it out in the recording sessions and the mixing process, is how we actually control the frequency space, which means that at any given time, we are able to provide a home to each one of the instruments and being heard clearly, which means that we need to understand what the contribution is for each one of the instruments that we have from the frequency perspective. So, for example, if we are looking at a passage which we have a piano and a guitar, okay, and the piano and the guitar are basically playing something in the same, I would say, range of notes, but a little bit different, what you're going to hear is probably a mess, because these two instruments, even though that they have a similar instruments in the mid-range, they could have been arranged differently. So, for example, the piano could have been doing some accompaniment in the low mid register, while the guitar is actually playing in the high mid frequencies on the high notes, but still doing a full accompaniment along with the piano, and they could live together in peace in this arrangement, and you will be able to hear both very clearly. So whenever you're doing an arrangement, think about what is the contribution for each one of the instruments you're going to have, and make sure that this instrument, it doesn't really matter how it's going to get mixed, but before the mix, the piece should be able to recognize and clearly identify each one of the instruments. Being working with clients that came with a lot of instrument playing all together, and nothing got transported over in terms of the combination of instrument because we couldn't hear. So my advice to them was okay, this guitar, it's great when it's actually being played by its own, but it's actually not great when it's being combined with this instrument. So I'm suggesting you to take it off the arrangement. This is something that happened in the recording session, and of course, this is something that should not happen in the recording session. It should happen in the thinking about how we're going to arrange the music smartly. Okay, so the bottom line is you need to control the frequency space of the instruments, and you will have to choose those instruments in order for all of them to live in harmony in the arrangement. So now, if you're talking about instrumentation and arrangements, I just wanted to point out the available instrumentation choices that we have nowadays for music. And you probably are familiar with that, but let me give you some insights of what type of those choices are good for. So in general, you're going to find that there are three types of instrumentation choices that you can work with in the modern music environment. The first one, if using electronic instruments, everyone is familiar with using synthesizers or any type of electronic-driven instrument. That could be potential emulations of instruments. They are used for a certain genre of music, but also they are used for other effects as well. For example, I've been using electronic instrument also in my film music composition as a contrast to all instrumentation that was more classical orchestral instrumentation. It works very, very nice to create an effect on that. So this is the electronic instruments. Then we have the acoustic instrument that everyone knows, people recording that in the studio. Could be a drum set, could be a guitar, electric bass, everything that is actually has to be recorded. Okay. And the good news about the acoustic instruments is specifically it has an emotional component when we are playing an instrument. When a person is at an instrument playing it, I don't believe that there's a similar effect of any other type of instrumentation choices that we can have for electronic music or hybrid type of ones. So this is something that you need to take into account. You're having a session and you will think about the acoustic instrument as something valuable. The drawback of acoustic instruments, of course, is that you will have to find talented musicians, at least the ones that have the minimal talent to play the instrument that you intended in your recording. And sometimes, sometimes we're struggling with that. It happened to me. I'm not talking about just instruments, I'm talking about vocalists. So create a balance of that if you're able to do that. And really, an acoustic guitar will sound amazing here. Okay, and if you have the ability to do that and play it, just do it, because it creates a lot of contrast with the rest of the instrumentation choices. And the next one is what we call the hybrid instrumentation. And the hybrid instrumentation is a combination between what we call virtual libraries, which are emulations and actual samplers or sampling elements that are triggered by MIDI, that we can emulate the several instruments in the market. It's typically being used for orchestral instruments, strings, brass, woodwinds, and so forth, but also for piano and for saxophone and some other ones. We are triggering these emulated instruments by MIDI, and we are programming those instruments on MIDI. And the good thing is that you have access nowadays with amazingly good quality of instrument that you can have in the market, relatively at very affordable prices. And you can still have a trumpet there, and you can still have some sort of a violin solo playing and so forth. Now, the drawback of that is that since this is not actually a real player playing, you will have to, first of all, be very knowledgeable how to program that. Meaning that you need to be conscious about how to program to sound realistic. So realistic implies not just having the right samples being played, but also how you play the samples, how you play the legatos, how you play the portamentos, understanding whoever is actually running or programming these instruments, virtual instruments, they need to understand about the instruments. The best thing to think of, if you're going to program a violin, you probably need to know how to play the violin, or need to know exactly what the essence, what are the articulations of a violin, how it sounds, what things are available at the violin, what things cannot be done. Okay, the same way as the woodwinds, for example. People sometimes do some mock-ups for woodwinds or some winds instruments in general, and they program in a way that they believe that the player doesn't have to breathe, and they have to breathe. So we need to program that. So there's a lot of knowledge behind that. It took me probably 15 years to get into a situation that I feel comfortable myself with the virtual instruments I'm using. The composition part of these instruments is relatively easy. The most complicated or complex part of it is to make them sound realistic. And within the hybrid instrumentation, there's a possibility that I use a lot, what I call augmentation of instrumentation or sample-based instrumentation, which is combining real instruments with sample libraries to create an augmentation, to create a different color, to create a different effect. I can use, for example, a section of strings, and I can actually add 3 or 4 violins and 2 violas and 1 cello on top of that, combine it in the mix, and that will create a very interesting approach. So you can actually, experience with that. If you have the ability to have some sample instrument, you want to combine it with actual acoustic instrument, a real instrument being played by real players, do that, and you will be amazed how great results you can have. The other thing is I want to talk about, which people do not talk a lot and which creates a great starting point, is what it's being called layering. Layering is the effect of combining several instruments to play exactly the same part to create, I would say, a different timbre of the instrument. Just an example of that, we can use a synthesizer or a pad combined with some sort of a flute or an emulated flute, and combine that with some sort of synthesizer type of, drone or something like that. And it opens up for a lot of creativity. And basically you're playing something that is not a clear type of instrument, but it's a layered instrument. I learned to experiment with that, creating amazing choices for any type of, chordal arrangements, when I, spread out different chord notes with different instrument, creating something that it's not possible to be done with just one instrument. So take that into consideration. And a few other important tips about the instrumentation. First of all, when we're talking about number of elements in instrumentation, we're talking about elements in the sense of their function in the overall arrangement. The instrumentation elements could be a rhythmic element, a melodic element, a secondary melodic element, or an harmonic element. Typically, even that we are using more instruments, my recommendation is to limit the number of elements to 4. Okay, there's sometimes people have put a lot of combination of, I have a melody, I have a secondary melody, have a contrapuntal type of melody on top of that, and there's another flute that is actually playing a little bit notes here and there as a melody, and on top of that, the accompaniment and everything like that. Creates a lot of trouble, not just from the arrangement itself, but also during the mixing process. It's practically not possible to mix something that has not been laid out in a way that it's clear. So it's a balance between having a concise type of instrumentation which have all the required elements into that. It doesn't really matter how many of them. Some of the piece of music, which is, for example, minimalist music, which have just one element. It could be just a pad, okay? But some of them may have up to 4. So keep that in mind when you are doing this type of instrumentation choices. And as I said before, everything in its own frequency range. Study that. Even go into your DAW and analyze exactly what is, if you're not familiar with the frequency range of the instruments or the type of sounds you are getting from a synthesizer, just pick the frequency spectrum that that particular instrument is generating for you to understand what it. Once you have familiarity with that, you understand, identify those frequencies very fast. But at the beginning, if you need help with that, use a spectrum analyzer just to get you an idea on how we are going to lay it out, because later on in the mix, you're going to using complementary equalization that will be based on having some sort of a niche spot in the frequency range for each one of those instruments. That's the only way you're going to succeed in the mixing process. And the last thing, which is probably, I would say that's the most important, is whenever you're putting up an instrument in your arrangement, make sure you understand what are the strengths of that instrument and what are the weaknesses of this instrument. Not just understanding what the instrument can or cannot do. If you're having an instrumentation and on top of an arrangement where you're expecting an instrument to do something that is not expected to do as such instrument, obviously that's not going to work. And I'm talking about several aspects, talking about timbre-wise, I'm talking about in the range perspective, we talked about the tessitura, and we talk about the sound shape, for example, transient type of melody. Obviously, I'm going to use something like a piano or something that is an acoustic guitar that have a very important transient component. But I'm not going to be using something like the flute. Doesn't have that. And it's important because that will provide you with the clarity that you need also in the audio processing process itself during the mix. My best recommendation to you, and this little sticker here, it's innovate, okay? Try to get out of the box. It's amazing the amount of creative things you can do with everything we just talked about with regards to the instrumentations and the arrangement. Innovate, they will get you into a situation that you will break through the noise and bring up something new to listen to. This was for part number 2. I hope you have enjoyed that, and hopefully you already have watched part number 1. If not, you can go back to the description. You will find the full playlist with the 3 videos. And anything that you have any comments please put it in the comments in this video. Of course, I read all the comments and I respond to them. It's very important also for me to learn about what you think about this material and some more feedback about any of the concepts that we talked about. So with that, I'm going to see you in part number 3, where we're going to talk about especially on room acoustics, mixing, and mastering to end this masterclass. Thank you very much.